Hello, my name is Julia Rimmer. I'm really pleased to be able to join you today to share with you some of the emerging findings from what's an ongoing research project running here at the University of East Anglia, looking into the later lives of adoptive families. So by later lives, we mean essentially when the next generation arrives. So that's when adoptees themselves become parents, and the people who adopted them, their adopters, become grandparents through adoption. So the research is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. It started in June 2018 and we hope to finish by the end of the year. So this study is exploratory. It's the first of its kind that's been done in the UK. Its aim is to provide a new understanding of the lived experience and needs of adopted people who are now parents and of their adopters who are now grandparents. Adoption is a huge intervention into family life, and we need to understand better how that's played out for the people who were adopted in recent years. We also need to think about what their support and service needs are. We'll be focusing today on just the stories of adoptee parents. So we're looking at adoption in England in roughly the last 30 years, so since the Children's Act in 1989. Most adoptions in this context are what we call domestic adoptions, so children adopted from the care system. They're usually under age 5 and they're usually placed with what we call matched parents, so people previously unknown to the child, not usually their foster carers or kinship carers, but with new parents. The lifelong impact of adoption is well known, but there's actually little evidence about how adoption affects people beyond childhood, and especially for people adopted more recently. And we don't know much about how the transition to parenthood affects these people either. So the study data today draws on the accounts of 20 men, that's 20 dads, and 20 women, 20 mums, and they are primarily adopted from the late 1980s onwards, and they're now parents. And we sought to include a diverse range of experiences. The methodology we're using is called life story narrative interviews. So these allow people to tell us their story in their own way. The interviews take about an hour and a half to 3 hours, so they're quite lengthy, and people can tell us their own story in their own way within a given structure. So, what are the types of stories adoptees are telling us about their lives as adoptees and about becoming parents? Well, the analysis is ongoing, but so far we think we have about between 4 to 6 what we're calling types of stories, so adoptee to parent life stories, that seem to be sort of distinct groups with commonalities within them and distinctions between them. So we're going to present 4 here today to show the range of stories in a continuum from less to more troubled stories. So this first type of story we're calling Happy to be Adopted. It doesn't define me too much and makes me interesting. So for parents in this group, adoption and being an adoptee is not really a prominent identity in their life story. They're often older interviewees, so more's been processed perhaps. Most of them were adopted as babies and come from backgrounds where there's less adversity perhaps. Some of them are actually also adopters themselves, so they've gone on to adopt children, sometimes alongside having birth children of their own. They're mostly untroubled stories that describe a happy life in the adoptive family and becoming stable parents, and they usually live independently of their adoptive families, supporting themselves and their families. Usually there's little firm interest from these people in knowing or finding out about their birth family. Whether they've explored their birth family or not, the issues are usually resolved, so they might be resolved positively or negatively, but they are resolved. They find telling their stories generally to be quite straightforward. The stories often explore the issues in depth and are mostly sort of positive or optimistic in tone. In these stories, adoption's not framed often as a loss, but sometimes as an advantage, a sort of interest or quirk. So an example of this type of story would be Joey. Joey was age 30 at the time of the interview. He is partnered with 2 young children who are just school age. He was adopted as a baby and has an unrelated adopted sister. So Joey accepted the narrative that he was given by his adoptive parents. As the quote says, he was totally accepting of that and quite proud of it. He never really questioned much about his biological origins. He says, "To me, it was just, I'm fine, I totally accept this." And I think that continued until, and my position hasn't changed so much. It does change a bit when children come along. So things haven't changed so much. He still feels more or less the same way. So he's happy in his current relationship. Parenthood at age 25 was unplanned, but it was embraced positively by the couple. But him being a dad is not really a dominant identity in his life story. The life story he does tell, though, is not entirely untroubled. It's largely about his transformation in overcoming what was significant anxiety and digestion issues which plagued him as a teenager and a young adult. He explicitly states these issues are not to do with his adoption and places their causes elsewhere, and he sought and received support for those independently. So allied to this story of transformation is his becoming a musician as well, and that's seen as something that's very positive for him. His performance gives him a lot of confidence and self-esteem. He's integrated and proud of his adoptee identity and sees it as being a unique feature. He's got only happy memories of life as an adopted child and doesn't really see any challenges in being an adopted person. He does mention that not having his family's medical history was a bit of an inconvenience when his partner was pregnant, and he enjoys seeing his children's resemblance to him physically, but it's not really a big deal for him in terms of his adoption. So Joey's interest in taking part in this research was in many ways triggered by the fact that his adopted sister has had a very different experience, both of being adopted and becoming a parent, which has sadly involved her having her children removed from her care. So as the quote says, his experience he assumed to be the norm, but found out that there's a whole other side to this. And if it hadn't been for her, he wouldn't have given his adoption a second thought. So it has made him rethink the significance of it all. But his conclusions are quite different to hers. So the second type of story we want to share with you today are what we're calling overcoming the odds type stories. So these parents are often from backgrounds of adversity with past psychosocial problems and or developmental issues. So they often relate complex feelings being triggered by becoming parents, and some initial fears or anxieties are expressed by themselves or others around that. But they're actually stable parents who are now living independently or interdependently, so close to their adoptive families and with a lot of interdependencies between the 2 households. So most of the issues that they talk about from the past have been explored and are resolved and are integrated into their main narrative identity. So they're largely stories of what we would call redemption, so their tone is positive and optimistic. So an example of this overcoming the odds type story would be Kira. So Kira's age 32, she's the stepmother to her partner's children, and together they have a child of their own, so there's 3 children in the family. She was adopted late, so age 7, as part of a sibling group from a background of abuse and neglect. So for Kira, being legally adopted in her life story is the key positive turning point, because with the adoption, 3 of the youngest of 4 siblings who were separated in foster care were finally reunited. So they were in foster care for a long time, for 3 years. So adoption was seen and is seen as being a fresh start. So there was permanence with adoptive family who were pleased to have them. So the family as a whole are committed to being open and positive about adoption. There's more than one adoption within the wider family, and the support was available from the parents and in the form of counselling from a really good social worker who knew the children's case very well, and they also received ongoing therapy, or Kira did. Kira's been determined to challenge negative expectations of adoptees and care leavers. So her life story mostly chronicles her success in overcoming negative assumptions about adoptees. So that includes challenging bullies at school, completing a degree, and also waiting to be in a healthy and stable relationship before planning her own family. So what was also important to her was that the stepchildren that came with her partner were really settled and established before they started trying for a child of their own. So for Kira, she'd always wanted to be a mother of 3 children, but she'd waited till the stepchildren were settled before her and her partner decided to try to have a child of their own. And when she did become pregnant, she was elated. Unfortunately, maternity professionals spoiled that a little bit. So first of all, they made her feel responsible for not having her full medical history in terms of her biological family. And also there was one health visitor who put a really negative spin on her and her partner's capacities as parents because of their backgrounds. So she asked Kira to rate her childhood in terms of its happiness on a scale of 1 to 10. And Kira said, oh, it wasn't good at the beginning and then it was better when I was adopted, but the health visitor just assumed it was bad. So she felt that she'd been put in a box, that she was going to need help and she was going to struggle to be a mum. As said in the quote, that really put a dampener on her happiness during pregnancy, but she actually put a complaint in against this health visitor, so she managed to change things and get a different one. So Kira consciously parents in opposition to her birth family and talks about that in the interview. Although trauma affects memory in some ways adversely, she says that she remembers much of the abuse in the family home, and she parents in opposition to that, so she doesn't shout at her children in the way that she was shouted at. So Kira's family live independently and happily. They've got good supportive relationships with family. So the third type of story I want to share with you today are stories where there's ongoing struggle and parents need support. So again, these are often from backgrounds of adversity, but there are ongoing psychosocial problems and or developmental problems. These parents relate, again, complex feelings being triggered and fears and anxieties being expressed by themselves or others around becoming parents. These stories have a presence of unresolved issues which are actually contaminating their lives as adults or parents. They're usually functioning as parents, but often with a lot of support, either from their adoptive families or from their partners as well. So these stories are often patchy. Parents are struggling to make sense of the life stories they're telling us as they tell them. So the narrative tone is often pessimistic or depressive, although it can have brighter shades within it. So an example of this type of story of ongoing struggle would be David. David is age 31. He has 2 birth children with different partners. He has shared custody for the eldest of the 2 children, a daughter, and he shares that with his adoptive mother who he lives with still. So he was adopted at age 6 months old, so quite young. David really struggled to actually tell his life story and had to be helped quite a lot with that by the interviewer. He didn't include his journey to adoption in the life story he told, but did describe a lot of struggling with identity issues and feelings of being rejected by his birth family when he was growing up. And that first quote kind of exemplifies that really. Just that constant question gnawing away at him, why did it happen? He searched without any support and quickly found his birth parents when he was 26. And that was just when his second child had been born, although he doesn't link the 2 events in the narrative. When he did discover them, he found out that he was the middle of lots of siblings who actually remained with the birth mother, so he was very confused as to why he was the one who was placed for adoption. Meeting his birth parents has left him deeply disappointed, and he no longer is in contact with them. He has lost touch with most of his siblings too, apart from an elder birth sister who he's still in touch with. He doesn't talk much about how he came to be the father of either of his children, or about why he has shared custody with his adoptive mother for his daughter. but he does strongly identify as a loving and protective father, and he talks a lot about shielding his children from negative influences, and he's very sensitive to the potentially harmful influence of his daughter's birth mother, who lives a chaotic lifestyle, and often she doesn't turn up to contact with the daughter. But he's really, really clear in his interview that he doesn't want his daughter to miss out on having that contact with her birth mother. So his greatest loss in life was actually the loss of his dog, which was unusual, and he talks about that in detail. And in describing why that's the biggest loss of his life, he talks about being kind of fatalistic and negative about his outlook on life. As the last quote says, everything that was good sometimes somehow gets turned upside down or taken away. His hopes for the future are to win the lottery and to be able to provide more for his children and to live independently of his adoptive mother. There isn't really a we story in terms of his family. He mostly just talks about himself and his adoptive mother, and his sister, who's actually pregnant at the moment, aren't really characters in his story. So the last type of story I want to share with you today are stories that we've termed robbed of parenthood. So these, again, are often parents from backgrounds of extreme adversity with ongoing psychosocial problems or developmental problems that are quite significant. They also quite often talk about relationship problems, issues with trust. Domestic violence is also common in these stories. So being a parent is actually a key identity for the people we're interviewing here, despite not being able to be a hands-on parent. There's often feelings expressed of the system being against them, that they've been robbed of parenthood. These are largely stories where there are unresolved issues and things have not turned out well. So the tone often varies between resignation to the reality of that, and also between that and being falsely optimistic or hopeful for the future. So although circumstances that they're living in haven't really changed, they're often quite hopeful they will be able to keep children in the future. So an example of this last type of story would be Mary. Mary is 24. She's the mother to 3 children who've all been removed and adopted as infants. She herself was adopted by her foster carers aged 5, but this disrupted in the teens, and then she was returned to care. So she told an extremely traumatic life story, but with surprising ease and some style. She was removed from this extreme abuse and neglect in her birth family at age 4, so quite late. Her adoption age 5 by her foster carers was understandably plagued with attachment problems, which wasn't helped by the surprise arrival of her adopter's own birth child, so they thought they were infertile previously. So there was lots of acting out behaviour and tensions in the adoptive family, which led to the adoption breakdown and her being returned to care. Unfortunately, in care, she was groomed and subjected to a violent sexual assault. Now, that's been successfully prosecuted through the courts, but has understandably left her with post-traumatic stress disorder. She's had a number of relationships with violent and abusive men and had numerous miscarriages, which aren't linked to that violence, but to a medical condition. M13 doesn't have a strong identity around being an adoptee, as the breakdown was obviously a big issue there. That adoption breakdown is presented in her life story as a very negative turning point that ruined her entire life, and that's shown in the quote above. So Mary has a strong maternal identity. Her 3 removed adoptive children are really present in her mind and in the interview, and there's pictures of them all around the room where she was being interviewed. She says you will never feel the love that you feel from when you have kids. So in many ways, the surge of love was something that she always wanted to experience. She is proud of having brought children into the world and of their development in their adoptive families, so she gets contact letters from them and photographs. So she's living for these children and the promise of reunification with them when they're adults, and that is the thing that she says keeps her from actualizing her suicidal thoughts. She has little else going on in her life. She didn't complete her education, hasn't worked. She does have a current boyfriend who she's hoping to marry, and she is linked to support organisations and hopeful of being able to keep children in the future. Her ties to her adoptive parents are severed, apart from a distant aunt who she occasionally contacts. The adoptive parents were approached to take her first child, and she is annoyed that they refused to take that child. So as we develop our narrative analysis, we'll be looking to explore in more detail what it is within these different types of stories that means that people have happy and fulfilling lives as adoptees, and what are the things that are very difficult for them to overcome. We're looking also at what the implications would be for practice. So we're hoping to discuss some of these emerging ideas with our stakeholders to develop something more comprehensive. But we have three main areas currently that we're looking at. So the first is around support that adoptees are receiving when they're growing up, to process their past and to develop good relationships with their adoptive parents, and contact with birth family maybe before they partner and parent. That's vital, but has been very, very difficult to come by for some of the people in our study. Secondly, we're looking at emerging implications for practice around adoptees as parents. So they're likely to benefit from support to process complex feelings that may resurface when they start to have children of their own. Some may also need help with parenting, but we've had a lot of instances where people talk about being wary of asking for help for fear that it's met with negative expectations of them and with negative repercussions. Finally, there needs to be a range of specific and accessible support available for all adult adoptees. In the UK, there is currently a significant unmet need here. So thank you for listening. It's been great to be part of this seminar, done in a slightly different way. The project team are Professor Beth Neal, myself, and Dr. Irina Serbu. We can be reached by email at adopted.parents.ac.uk. We also have a Twitter handle, and we are funded by the ESRC and have a web page for the project too, where you can hopefully follow us as we start to report our results. Thank you. Bye.